Okay, I think we're ready to go. Dan, it's Mary Rowe here from the Canadian Urban Institute. I'm so pleased to be back on the World City stage. What an extraordinary couple of days this is. So hats off to Chris and his colleagues and Jen and all the people that have been working on this tirelessly to put so much great content into these couple of days. Honestly, it's just a rich, rich trove, and I know it's all going to be available for watching subsequently. We know from our own experience producing City Talk, and we're a great partner for, we're really pleased to be partnered with World City as much as we could be here in Canada to bring the best experiences we could so we could share what we're all learning. And we find that people do watch these things again and again and again. So if you're tuning in live, this is one of the live ones. There have been a number recorded and across many time zones and many jurisdictions. So really thrilled to have Dan Hill. Of course, Canadians love this Dan Hill almost as much as they love the other Dan Hill. I couldn't anchor the session without always having the Canadian joke that poor Dan Hill in Sweden has to be subjected to each time. But we're very appreciative of this Dan Hill, who is the director of the strategic design at Vinnova, which is Sweden's innovation government entity, of which we're all quite envious. We all have a Swedish envy, just so you know, Dan, we do. And but so appreciative that you share your expertise with others, not just in Sweden, but around the world. And this is a perfect platform. So again, hats off to World City. We love the fact that we're sandwiched between Usman Hawk talking about what he's talking about, and following us will be Mayor John Tory, the Mayor of Toronto, with Leslie Wu. So terrific opportunity for us to hear about the Hyperlocal, which I'm a big fan of. I wore this t-shirt this morning to honor Dan, which says, more Jane Jacobs, less Mark Jacobs. Inside joke for my friends and colleagues from New York who will be tuning in. And I'm a huge believer in hyperlocal. It's all about the local and how do we actually affect people's environment in which they are surrounded every day. So, and here we are during COVID, still parts of the world still afflicted seriously by COVID, other places starting to emerge a bit. So Dan, really timely for us to hear from you. I'm going to pass to you to give us some of your initial thinking about how hyperlocal and design and the role of planning can really affect people's lives. So over to you, Dan. Thanks for joining us, and I'm going to listen with great interest.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to World City as well, as you say, amazing work. And I'm desperately trying to think of a joke about sometimes when we touch base, Mary, it's the only time
that's pretty good. You got it in there.
It's the only time anybody ever reminds me of the other Dan Hill, which I know, which is big in Canada. So yeah. Anyway, hello, Canada. But I'm the other one, one of the other ones. There are a few of us around. I work in Sweden, so I'm coming to you from Stockholm, from the top of my house here in the suburbs of Stockholm, actually. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about hyperlocal stuff, as you said, Mary. And we did a great talk on this last year, I think, with your institute. So I'm really happy to see you again. And I know you'll have some good questions for me. So let me get into it. We've been leading some work here over the last 2 years, really, around, so it's pre-COVID actually, which is interesting, around retrofitting streets. Obviously during COVID, and we're still in it, cities around the world have been looking at how they might begin to rethink street environments based on traffic disappearing for a while at least, and doing amazing work. And we're inspired by that as well. But we were working on this for a while before that happened, as with places like Barcelona with their Superblocks project, Paris with the 50-minute city, and so on. And the way we interpreted it here was what we call with mission-oriented innovation, so drawing from the work of my colleague at UCL, Mariana Mazzucato, defining missions for places, and missions in this case for the nation. And here you see it on the screen. This is a glimpse of Stockholm in the summer. Every street in Sweden should be healthy, sustainable, and vibrant by 2030. So we can talk forever about what those things might mean. Maybe we'll have questions about that. But we're setting a real agenda here, working from the ground up around every street. Every street is a social justice question. Everybody deserves to have a healthy, sustainable, and lively street, put it that way. Vibrant could mean, by the way, full of life, as in full of birds and butterflies and biodiversity, but relatively quiet to human ears. Or it could mean a busy, downtown on a Friday night, either way, as the street decides. And this came from work that we did kind of stirring up the system around streets, really. So we really did a ton of engagement work with stakeholders. And I'll come to citizens in a moment, but obviously these people are citizens as well often. And I mean citizens in the generic sense of the word, almost the Roman, the Latin sense perhaps, but I don't mean as national citizens, I just mean residents and people that live and work and play in the city. I'll come to that, but we did work with stakeholders to begin with, and we need actors in the system. So people trying to run public transport agencies in cities and city governments, or people doing, I see e-cargo startup bike operators here, Volvo cars, car sharing, or micromobility companies and national transport agencies. We pulled them all into this room at the same time and started these conversations, usually using archetypes of streets mapped onto real places, but getting them to simultaneously draw and sketch intervention points, using their knowledge as to where we might make a mark in the system. So not to decide what to do precisely, but to give us a hint as to where to start. That could be municipal transport planners or people from e-scooter startups here. I see Ericsson in here, as well as a health researcher from university looking at air quality, all talking at the same time about the same kind of thing, and using the system to bring the system into the room effectively, to work together holistically. Now, from that, we get starting points into streets. And so we were lucky to work with Stockholm municipality on this, who gave us 4 streets to work with, to prototype in. And those streets happened to have schools on them, which meant that we could really push on this participation model of then having the street designing the street. So this is where the citizen participation comes in. So we chose 4 streets, very generic streets in a way, in and around the middle of Stockholm. As I said, there's schools on them, and we really put the pens in the hands then of school kids. In this case, 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds, had them designing the street, them being the primary actors. They are the experts in their street. If we'd had an aged care center on the street, then it would be 80-year-olds in the picture. If it was student housing, it would have had 18-year-olds, but in this case, it was a school, so we had 8-year-olds or 7-year-olds even. We've also done this exercise, by the way, with the Prime Minister and the Health Minister. I won't test you on your knowledge, Mary, as to which one's the Prime Minister in this picture. It's not me. But you can do this at multiple levels. But I'd say that kids are actually better than this, with all due respect to the Prime Minister, when it comes to their environment. Again, they're the experts in their street. And these are the kind of sketches the kids came up with, and you kind of see the interventions they're looking at. Again, these streets before are full of, I should have had a picture really, but I just imagine a generic street full of parking spaces. Not that many people around, actually. But in this case, when the kids get their hands on it, it becomes full of fake palms. Fake because we're in Sweden. Swing sets, beaches, fountains, cafes, and so on. But then we want this to be a national scale thing. So we work with ArkDes, the National Centre for Architecture and Design, who commissioned a Swedish design firm called Lundberg Design, who came up with this model for this base layer that can sit in parking spaces. So it's the dimensions of a parking space, but it's kind of like a boardwalk. So you can actually extend it or shrink it. It could cover the whole street. It could just be a few parking spaces. And on top of that, you have applications as decided by the street itself. So the street then decides we need more trees, we need more parking for bikes, we need more social spaces, whatever. So this application layer, a bit like on your phone, is separate from the infrastructure layer. They're then built in Swedish timber and deployed into the street. And I've shown these pictures a lot around the place, but this is then in Stockholm and Gothenburg, the second biggest city in Sweden, and Helsingborg, sort of city number 5 or 6, sorry, Helsingborg, if I put you in the wrong spot. And they're each one's testing different things. They're all sort of customizable. They're made of wood on purpose, so they can be changed and adapted. The fact that wood won't last forever is actually really useful in this sense. Usually we make the mistake of trying to reduce maintenance costs with streets and make things in concrete and steel so we don't have to touch them for 50 years. But we're sort of saying, actually, it's really good if these things have a clock running, which is more in line with culture, because cultures change quite quickly, potentially. And so, you know, as you know, we're stuck with the streets from the 1950s around us, often in places like Sweden, even though the culture is radically different. So having something which builds in this kind of need for change is really important. And we can reframe maintenance then as care. And care is a positive thing. Maintenance is seen as a negative thing, but it's actually positive as well. So the fact that the wood won't stick around for more than a couple of years actually gives us a reason to go back in there and keep testing it and keep refining it. We work with the artist and musician Brian Eno on these design principles with this. And the one in the bottom left there is really key to what I said. Make places that are easy for people to change and adapt. So use wood and plaster instead of steel and concrete. And that is incredibly hard to work through with, as you can imagine, a transport department in a municipality. They've been great partners on this, but it's exactly the opposite logic that they would usually do. And similarly, the one in the top left there, think like a gardener, not an architect. Design beginnings, not endings. So here, I mean, a good architect does this, so with all due respect to the architects out there. but focusing on how do we get things off on the right footing and set a course in terms of outcomes, but not really trying to design in precisely what it will be in 10 years, but get things going, get the conversation started, get something happening on the street with citizens feeling they're in charge of the discussion, because they are in charge of it in this model. That's really powerful, and that then requires tending, like a garden again, a very different dynamic to planning, completely the opposite culture. But like planning, you can also talk about typology. So we can go from a parking space to a street to all the streets in Sweden, which is about 40,000 kilometers. At some level, they're all the same. They all have the same parking space law, for instance. At another level, they're completely different from street to street, even in Stockholm. Never mind Stockholm to Gothenburg or Malmö. So you have this balancing act of super local, diverse, and then generic and regional and national. So far, it's looking quite good in terms of resident feedback here, or citizen and resident feedback. So passers-by and residents, 73% approval rating, 400% increase in activity here. And we're looking at what kind of value is generated. This is really powerful, potentially, like all of the possible value generated. I know you can't read all of this, but imagine a lot of research suggesting the impact on biodiversity, physical activity, property, maintenance, social fabric, learning, health and well-being. We have all of this research, but it's very rarely aligned around the street. These simple wooden interventions handled systemically give us a reason to bring this together as a different kind of culture around it, which also means that we're stacking up then the system behind these simple prototypes. So, or complex prototypes in a way, but at the green layer at the top there, you might have the actual interventions in Stockholm, Helsingborg, Umeå, Gothenburg, and so on. And they're super specific and very local. But underneath the hood, you have these standardized layers of financing and policy and law and so on. And on the right-hand side, you can just see our project partners there run from the National Transport Agency right down to the ground, or from the ground up to the agency, depending on how you want to think about that, including commercial partners like Volvo and Voi and scooter companies, as well as researchers and so on. And there's a possible set of visualizations emerging, this lovely work by Utopia Architecture to describe where this could go. And ultimately, then we're talking about this kind of different logic for changing things. It's actually, although we start with a mission, it's really predicated on complex systems thinking. This guy, Ilya Prigogine, was a great thinker about this, along with people like Donella Meadows. Small islands of coherence have potential to change the whole system. And that's the way we know that cities work, actually. They work in this small pieces, loosely joined kind of way. So ultimately, we can begin to thread together, as this diagram shows, the 1 minute city on the right-hand side there, there's super local questions, streets and blocks and playgrounds and so on. The 15-minute city layer, neighborhoods, schools, and so on. And then this kind of 60-minute city layer, which is much bigger scale again. And there's different kind of cultures of decision making at those different scales. You can let the street handle the decisions at the 1 minute city, arguably. The 15-minute city becomes this interplay between street and municipality, community, neighborhood, municipality. At the 60-minute city, you're talking about things like stadiums and subway systems, and that's hard to crowdsource from the street up. That is a significant representative democracy model at that point. And this enables us to start thinking about arranging these decisions at different scales, testing these things in different cultures of decision making, and thinking how they all align. They're all nested within inside each other. But this project I've talked about today, in the context of our talk now with Mary, it'll be about this kind of super local, but I just wanted to put it into this broader context of a city is made up of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these super local decisions and cultures. That's where I'm going to leave it, and I'm going to throw back to Mary in the studio, as they say, and see if we can now kind of have a chat between the two of us.
Back in the studio, here we are. Thanks, Dan. I'd encourage people to put into the chat here, tell us where you're listening from, and if you have specific questions, and I'll ask a few of them right off the bat. So curious from one of the viewers, Dan, how did you end up connecting with Brian Eno?
I work with him at UCL is the quick answer. So we've been part of a group there at an institute. Again, we all sort of hover in the orbit around Mariana Mazzucato, who's the center of the university in that world, the economist. And she brought in Brian, and we worked together a little bit, weirdly, as it sounds, on the UK's industrial strategy. We were looking at things like transport, and he and I immediately sort of struck up a chord around, hey, how about we design a city where things move a little less And what would that mean? Or things that move a little more slowly, as opposed to trying to just make things more efficient and move things rapidly. That was very much his thinking. So yeah, he's a brilliant thinker.
I mean, the point here is an artist has a perspective on things and has a perspective on ambient environments. Thanks everybody that's checking in. We've got people coming in from Europe and South America, and terrific to have everybody there. And somebody from my old employer, from MAS NYC. Hi, I am. I used to work at MAS. Dan, I think one of the challenges we've got here is you're vesting a lot of importance in shared public space. And COVID has introduced a level of threat that people have experienced in terms of getting back into those kinds of shared public spaces, whether it's transit or streets or community amenities. Thoughts on how we're going to step in and actually get people to get their confidence back? I feel like people have lost the muscle to get back into those engagements. And are you observing that at all too? And even as COVID numbers diminish, we're not seeing as quick a take-up of people getting back out. Thoughts on that?
I think it's super specific, because I'd say that isn't the case in Sweden, but we've had a very different COVID response, and you know, almost a different COVID, almost a different COVID, you know.
Yeah.
And just as it's different again in Australia or New Zealand, it's different in Israel and Singapore, you know. And so I think, again, I would say there are some core messages we might learn from this about the value of putting health first. That was very interesting to see. Actually, the reason we were able to effectively switch things off and reset some very fundamental things was about this putting public health first. That was turned out, you know, turns out we could do that. Turns out that we figured out actually the value of local neighborhoods, as well as you said, the corollary, which is people getting worried about shared spaces. I think outdoor shared spaces, super safe. Actually, when we know that a lot of the infection actually is carried indoors in closed environments. So I'd worry more about indoor environments than I would about streets. So, and it was super interesting to see actually begin to blur the edges. We could see restaurants kind of moving out into the streets, at least when the climate allowed it. Our climate in Sweden is, you know, similar to lots of your Canadian climates. So I think we've also seen this really interesting kind of moving around of the certainties and assumptions that were there before, that you couldn't run a city like that, or you couldn't put public health first, or we couldn't find the budget for this or the budget for that. And of course, actually all bets were off very quickly, and we could find the budget for these things. That's super interesting as well. So yeah, I can see there's been this, we've also had a bit more, you know, public transport isn't at the numbers it was, but actually not far off already. And it's played out, it's played out differently here. So I'd really urge, you know this very well, Mary, every single city has found a different route through this. There will be some broad patterns emerging. But again, this super local conversation, again, means we have to look culturally. I'd say one last thing. We have, of course, also started questioning things like shopping malls and office blocks, and knowing that we can work from home for, let's say, 50% of the week. Changes the dynamics of things like neighborhood layouts, city centers, and so on, and in a way is maybe a precursor to what's to come, just as e-commerce will be a much bigger threat to retail, physical retail, than COVID was. So give us a chance to rethink those things.
Yeah. Although, again, and I have a colleague, I think, on this session, and maybe she can put into the chat some work that we've been doing at COI, one which you know about, Dan, because we had started it when we talked with you last year, one on Bring Back Main Street. And that you know, those, as you say, retail was challenged before by digital purchasing. But then what we found is people have suddenly realized, well, wait, I have a small business a block from me, and I can make a digital purchase from that business and walk over, and or they can deliver it to me right at my door. So it's interesting for us to think about this, whether we can localize. And similarly, as you suggested, there's going to be a repurposing of downtown space, because we're not going to go into offices in the same way we once did. We'll still go, but different kinds of patterns of frequency. And so that's why we also came up with Restore the Core. And so I'm with you on this. I know it was your last slide, and of course it's the one that interests me the most, which is, what are the governance implications for you? So could we, Dan, really get serious about devolution and see if we could start, you know, your beautiful graphic of 60, 30, 15, and 1. Could we be putting more resources and more decision-making further to the left, so that local neighborhoods could start having the resources to make decisions that are hyper local? Do you think it's possible in COVID?
100%. I mean, it's just, you know,
Yeah.
It's a decision to make. It's a bit like your previous point about how we think retail might play out. It depends on what we decide to do as as a community. There's no certainty there. There's no law of physics, right? It's all what we decide to do. So local independent retail, totally fine. I'm super convinced of its resilience. All the data suggests that. The generic mainstream stuff, that'll be the stuff that disappears. Not a bad thing.
Are you seeing that in Sweden? Because we're seeing that here. The chains.
Seeing that, I'd say more in the UK, actually, more in the UK where I'm from. You can really see the dropout of department stores, which were the same in every single city, like franchises and chains.
Yeah.
That stuff is really problematic because it's more convenient to buy a more or less generic product online. The stuff that's super resilient, and there's some great work by Ryan Raffaelli at the Harvard Business School about this. He looked over the last 10 years, actually 2009, 2019, independent bookstores in North America increased in number by 50%. Right, so the stuff that goes out the door is the generic stuff. I mean, Amazon will just eat that for its lunch, it's fine. But Amazon cannot touch a local neighborhood bookstore because, as he points out, that's dealing with community, conviviality, culture. It's embedded. Amazon doesn't do that. It's just like a different ball game, and it can't really get at it. So I'm using Amazon as an example, obviously. But so I think so that's really important. Coming back to your question. Again, if we decide to prioritize these things, absolutely. And I live in Sweden. Sweden is maybe very devolved in that sense. You pay your income tax locally. Yeah. So the city government gets your income tax, not the national government. It's the exact opposite of the UK in this respect. The UK is super centralized. National government largely makes all the decisions, right? It's almost like a one-tier level. In Sweden, it's 3 tiers, just like Australia, where I've also lived. You have city, state. Yeah, exactly. And I know you do in Canada as well, but so your planning and your housing and your schooling is all organized by the municipality. The regional level handles public transport and healthcare and all of these things. So the national government really, where I work, is no more than a steering mechanism. I say that carefully because I work there. With some funding and some coordination and enabling city to learn from city and so on like that. Of course, it does military and things that make sense at a national scale. Right. So all I'm saying is with that diagram is let's have the discussion about what things make sense to decide at what scale. Yeah. And so there are some things that work super well at a neighborhood scale. There are some things that work well at a district scale. There are some things that clearly work well at, let's say, a bioregional scale. Watersheds, that's like a bioregional question. So what's our governance entity for that? And then finally, there might be some stuff at a national or international scale, also fine. But take it from that basis.
Yeah. I mean, it's a visualization of a concept that's very familiar to you in Europe, subsidiarity, that again, we have envy about because, as you suggest, there are certain orders of government that are best suited to delivering certain kinds of services. And generally, the level of order of government closest to the recipient of the service should be planning and implementing and probably financing and held accountable for that service. Here's where I think it's tricky. Climate. Mm-hmm. COVID's going to eventually lift and the new C word will be climate. We're about to head into COP26. I'm sure you have thoughts on this. Are there ways for us, for all the people who are engaged in the kind of lens that you're bringing to this, why hyperlocal so matters? How do we practice? How do we make some significant change around climate? Can we at the hyperlocal level?
Yeah. I think so the thing about that kind of scales of decision-making diagram is recognizing they're a bit sort of like nested like Russian dolls, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So the decisions that we make at the hyperlocal do ripple through to the district, to the city, to the region, and so on. They're all absolutely connected. And this is the thing that fries people's brains in political science and fries my brain too. Like everything is connected, so we cannot separate them out in that one or other. To see that connection. So then there are a series of decisions to make. So we can absolutely talk about climate impact at the scale of the street. If we flip our streets to be more like gardens, we clearly will be having impact. We're massively reducing carbon emissions through transport, improving the air quality. We're doing all of those things. You could organize energy at microgrid scale, at street. Neighborhood, district, and so on. And that will take X%. I'm going to undefine it. of the demand for that place. You can work at behavior change to reduce demand as well. That works really super well at a super local district level. You can understand how a network of microgrids might join up to something bigger and so on. Then clearly there are decisions that are more national scale, like coal mining in Australia, I guess tar sands in Canada. These are both regional and national scale political decisions. So yes, and if we don't get those right, then in a way it won't matter if I flip all the streets to gardens. So
but
it's kind of,
but it has to be both. It has to be both.
Exactly.
Because part of the dilemma I think people feel around climate is it's overwhelming to people, and they feel they're helpless. And yet, if we start to, I just love your think like a gardener, and that it scales. So you think about your local garden out your back door, and that plot that. But it's also national governments could be thinking like gardeners and saying we actually need interventions at every order. And I just don't know how we're going to get the political will, Dan, if we don't actually. It's same with public health. That's true in public health. Interventions to make me healthy, for me to embrace being healthy, happen out my back door. And then that affects national policy. So if you were to pick some priorities in the post-COVID time over the next, I don't know, whatever window you designers think on, what would they be?
We think on all windows simultaneously, or we try to.
Yeah.
No, I definitely think that this super local angle has real merit, because it's something we can start on. It's meaningful. It gets people engaged. Attitudes change after behavior changes is my view. Obviously, people know that way better. They research that for a living. But my understanding of that is that if we can get people engaged in activities like the things I showed you, very simple everyday stuff, actually attitudes about broader questions might well follow in their wake. So I would love to get people gardening, frankly, literally in the street, as well as using it as a metaphor. I'd love to get people cycling. I think people taking public transport, all of these things are completely within reach. And we may find that opens up a way of thinking at some point about the environment, which is way beyond their immediate vista. It is to do with questions like coal mining. But if we keep going in and saying, I need you to change your attitude about this, and we need you to vote on this or this at the wrong scale with no vested interest, really, no way of connecting it to my everyday life, super problematic. It's clearly going to create all kinds of backlash and dragging of heels and anger and frustration and so on. So yeah, I really emphasize this sense of how can people get involved. I think at city level, you can see a lot of progressive action around it for sure. And I think that because everything is connected, will ripple through into far more positive attitudes generally about collaboration at much bigger scales.
I feel as if part of what you folks is, I so appreciate the design discipline and what you bring to this, and people that think like designers, as artists, as Mr. Eno does, I'm sure, is what are the obstacles that need to be pulled out to make it easier to do these, to have this behavior change. And during COVID, it looks like we did some swift things. We got rid of some barriers. Any thoughts on? Yeah.
No, and I've seen cities from, Saskatoon all the way down, moving very rapidly in North American context, in ways that just would not be possible before. So short-circuiting rules and regulations. I find the North American landmass one of the most bureaucratic that I've ever worked in the world. The kind of level of regulations and forms and paperwork and liability agreements that, sort of get in the way. A lot of that stuff was just very quickly waved aside. So that's really interesting. So if we could start dealing with each other more as humans relationally and less as transactions in a bureaucratic system, that would make a huge difference right there. And we saw that happening with COVID. And then, if we talk as humans, as part of nature to each other in a place, I have huge hopes for us. If we outsource that to anything, machine learning or bureaucratic forms, not going to work.
And on that happy note, face-to-face interaction, people in a place. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us. Thanks again, World City, for having us have a chance to talk about why the hyperlocal matters and how it contributes to well-being. And we would say, eyes on the street and the future of not only our urban communities, but our larger societies. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to the mayor, Mayor Tory, who will follow with Leslie Wu. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Great chat. Thank you. Nice to see you.